Welcome to the Explainer. Let's just dive right into today's topic, which is a pretty somber historical postmortem. We're looking at a profound critique of Karl Marx, focusing specifically on Chapter 3, A Heart of Hell. We're going to unpack the anatomy of his revolutionary worldview and see how his ideas transitioned from 19th century philosophy into a very harsh historical reality. The source material takes us on a deep dive into the intellectual roots that basically grew into one of the most consequential and destructive ideologies of the modern era. The author establishes a huge foundational metaphor right off the bat, a society completely adrift. You know Captain Jack Sparrow's compass from the movies, right? It doesn't point true north. It magically points to whatever the person holding it desires most in that exact moment. Well, the source argues that modern humanity has done exactly that. We've traded the reliable true north of anchored objective truth for a compass driven entirely by subjective desire. And according to the author, when a culture navigates by what it wants rather than what is actually true, it's inevitably sailing into some very dangerous waters. So, to unpack how this happened, our source lays out a strict academic roadmap. The intellectual drift, a genealogy of ideas, Marx's dark poetry, oppressors versus the oppressed, the resulting ideological shipwreck, and finally, steps to recognize, resist, and restore. Let's start by looking at that initial intellectual drift. The very first crucial point the text makes is the stark difference between true philosophy and the dangerous drift of ideology. True philosophy, as the source defines it, is really tough work. It's the humbling process of reforming our subjective desires to align with objective truth. It's about changing ourselves to fit reality. But ideology? The author argues that ideology is the exact opposite. It's the practice of twisting and reforming the truth to justify whatever our subjective desires happen to be. And the source emphasizes that this inversion is incredibly dangerous, because once truth becomes flexible, literally any action can be rationalized. So where did Marx get his ideas? The text traces this fascinating intellectual genealogy. We start back in the 18th century with Jean-Jacques Rousseau's idealism, this utopian belief that humans are naturally good but get corrupted by society. Jump ahead to Charles Darwin in 1859, who introduces the scientific concept of a relentless natural struggle for survival. The author argues that Marx essentially took Rousseau of moral urgency for a perfect society and smashed it together with Darwin's ruthless evolutionary survivalism. By synthesizing those two things, Marx forged his own powerful theory of materialist class struggle. And that synthesis leads directly to what the author highlights as Idea 3. This is the absolute bedrock of Marx's revolutionary ideology. The idea that all human beings are divided into two distinct groups, the oppressed and the oppressors. According to the text, for Marx, this wasn't just a casual observation about society. It was the fundamental engine driving all of human history. In this worldview, there's absolutely no nuance, no individual variation, and no middle ground. Every single human interaction is viewed strictly through the lens of a brutal power struggle. Now, to understand how he arrived at such an extreme binary, the source says we really need to look at the cultural air Marx was breathing. He was born into a comfortable middle-class family in a European landscape totally saturated with Enlightenment ideals, championing reason over tradition, individualism, secularism, and progress. But the author points out a massive irony here. Marx would take these exact Enlightenment ideals of individualism and progress and use them to formulate a rigid collectivist system that completely undermined individual autonomy. He also borrowed heavily from Hegel's dialectic, which was the dominant philosophical framework of his day. This is the idea that progress happens through contradiction. A thesis, like exercise is best, meets its opposite, an antithesis, like diet is best. They clash and create a synthesis. Both are important. But the text notes that Marx stripped away all of Hegel's polite idealism. For Marx, this clash wasn't a philosophical debate. It was a ruthless, entirely material conflict over physical resources and power. But here's where things take a surprising turn. Beneath all the dry economic theories, the source points us to the deeply unsettling, dark poetry of a 19-year-old Karl Marx. Now, historians often brush this off as just edgy teenage angst, but our source argues that these vivid descriptions of hellish vapors and striking deals with the Prince of Darkness reveal a truly sinister starting point. The author interprets this as a deliberate, radical rebellion against the Judeo-Christian worldview of his time. The text actually points to these early writings as far more than just dramatic flair. They are viewed as a chilling, prophetic foreshadowing of the profound misery that would eventually follow his doctrines. When a young Marx writes about building a throne high overhead whose marshal is blackest agony, the text asks us to seriously consider the accuracy of those words. According to the source, These dark poetic visions perfectly and tragically describe the reality of the totalitarian regimes that would later implement his ideas. During his university years, Marx fell in with the young Hegelians. This was a radical group of 1830s German intellectuals who used philosophy to relentlessly tear down religion and promote secular humanism. The source details how this group really honed Marx's focus on the transformative power of radical ideas. But he actually grew really impatient with them. While the young Hegelians were totally content to sit around cafes debating consciousness, Marx wanted blood and iron reality. He famously decided that the point wasn't just to interpret the world, but to physically change it through earthly revolution. Which brings us straight to the core dichotomy of the 1848 Communist Manifesto, which he co-authored with Friedrich Engels. Marx firmly cemented his view of the world into two warring camps. You've got the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, the oppressors who own the production, and you have the proletariat, the oppressed working class, who have nothing to sell but their labor. The author notes that this incredibly simple framing became highly infectious. It provided a clear villain and an obvious victim, making it the perfect tool for mobilizing the masses. So, what did they actually want? The source details how Marx and Engels envisioned completely dismantling existing structures to forcefully transition into a classless society, and their demands were unapologetically extreme. They wanted the total abolition of private property, the centralization of all credit and communication into the hands of the state, and heavy progressive taxes. But most notably, they called for a dictatorship of the proletariat. The source highlights this specific demand for a centralized authority wielding absolute power as the fatal flaw that guaranteed future tyranny. The author poses some really critical questions about this utopian blueprint. Think about it. If all ownership is abolished and all resources are pooled by the state, who gets to decide who gets what? You're basically forced to blindly trust that the government officials won't just hoard the best resources for themselves. Furthermore, the text asks a profound question about human nature. If intense hard work, massive risk-taking, and innovation yield the exact same reward as doing absolutely nothing, what happens to human ambition? According to the source, under this system, the drive to build and improve simply withers away. The source offers a really unique framework for categorizing the fallout of this ideology, using the famous hammer and sickle symbol itself. The author classifies the hammer as a masculine error of overt revolutionary violence, physical destruction, and blunt tyranny. But the sickle, that's classified as a feminine error. The text describes this as a covert, emotional rewiring of society, a psychological manipulation that actively cultivates a victim mindset and weaponizes compassion to subvert objective truth from the inside out. And that leads directly to what the analysis calls the psychological shipwreck. The subtle tragedy of these ideas is how seductively they invite us to just lay down the heavy burden of personal responsibility. Instead of inspiring people to build and earn, the source contends this worldview breeds deterministic victimhood. It actively incentivizes you to believe that your failures are entirely someone else's fault. And when you believe that, it legally and morally justifies the urge to just take what others have earned. Now, the source notes that Marx didn't invent the desire to point the finger. That deeply ingrained instinct is as old as the Genesis story, right? Adam blames Eve. Eve blames the serpent. It is an ancient human flaw. But what makes this specific ideology so incredibly destructive, according to the author, is that it weaponizes that ancient scapegoat mechanism. It takes a personal moral failing, the refusal to take responsibility, and turns it into a celebrated, mandated political system. And the historical postmortem in the source material is totally unyielding on this point. When these ideas were implemented by regimes like Mao's China, Pol Pot's Cambodia, and Castro's Cuba, they didn't end in utopia. The text points out the staggering contrast between the ideological promise and the historical reality. The promise of equality and liberation consistently birthed brutal totalitarian dictatorships. The dream of commonwealth brought a complete loss of innovation, and the promise of classless harmony ultimately resulted in mass suffering and unmarked graves. But crucially, the author doesn't just leave this critique stuck in the past. They trace these destructive ideological echoes directly into our modern cultural moment. The analysis suggests that the deeply anti-Christian, rebellious spirit from Marx's teenage poetry is still very much alive. The source argues we see this spirit in modern pop culture phenomena, designed specifically to shock the public, to intentionally mock the Judeo-Christian worldview, and to slowly desensitize society until what was once considered unnatural is completely normalized. So, how do we navigate our current cultural moment? The author concludes with a specific three-step mandate. First, recognize. Identify the ideological drift happening around us and spot that pervasive victim mindset. Second, Resist. Reject the deeply human urge to play the scapegoat game, and resist the seductive call of our subjective desires. And finally, restore. Proactively anchor society back to objective truth, and embrace the difficult but totally necessary burden of personal responsibility. Which leaves us with a final provocative thought from the text. What guides your ultimate sense of reality? The author challenges us to ask a fundamental question. When the inevitable storms of culture and ideology hit, are you going to drift with the ever-shifting winds of subjective desires, or will you hold fast and anchor yourself to the true northern stars of objective truth? Something to really think about. Thank you for joining us for this explainer on the anatomy of an ideology. Keep learning, and we'll catch you next time.